Hello. Now normally I wouldn't make a video about a topic like this because it's not my kind of thing, but I just thought it was really interesting. A few days ago my wife brought it to my attention on one of the online newspapers about the Turin Shroud, or the Shroud of Turin. I'm sure many of you know what it is. It's said to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Now there's a new study came out which is an updated version of the original 1970s and the 2018 original studies. And they came up with a lot of interesting things. Very intriguing, and scientifically speaking, it's very convincing. So I will put the link of this article in the description box below. So I'm just going to give you some highlights of these articles, and then we can examine it together from the biblical standpoint and also from the secular historical standpoint, how much of it is true. Let's have a look. Now, according to this new study, the blood particles that they found on this shroud or in this piece of cloth, it demonstrated that the blood had actually had organ failure, trauma, disease in the blood, radiation, radioactivity, and other soil and dust and radiation particles. Also find the type A and type B blood. And they also saying that this image was imprinted miraculously at Jesus' resurrection. And they mention very scientifically sounding things like radioactive beta particles that was in the blood, and photon radiation particles that only can be produced through a nuclear reaction or during fireworks. And the article also mentions that, I'm quoting, "Some believe that Jesus' body was not washed during that time, but quickly placed in a tomb, which means he was not cleaned of earthly materials before being wrapped." And as a support for this, they bring from the Bible, from the book of Mark, the chapter 15, verse 46, which explains how Joseph, one of Jesus' disciples, removed Christ from the cross and bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. Now, of course, no one contesting this Bible passage because it's right in the Bible. You can look it up for yourself. But as you know, there are in the Gospel books there is 3 different accounts of how Jesus was buried. Mark was only one of them, but we're going to get back to that in a minute. But first, let's have a look how an ancient Jewish burial custom took place in Jesus' day. They say the body, clothed in a favorite garment, was then wrapped with winding sheets. Spices of myrrh and aloes were placed in the folds of the garment to perfume the body. A napkin was then bound from the chin to the head. The family took the body on a bier to be buried within hours of the death, not days. And it says that after the person died, his or her eyes were closed. The body was washed with scents such as nard, myrrh, and aloe. The body was then wrapped in a cloth and carried to the family's home where relatives and neighbors could visit. And within 8 hours, it was carried on a bier on a litter to the tomb, so visitors can see. And women was leading this procession, this funeral procession, where family members are often torn their garments in sign of grieving. The body was then laid into a tomb which was carved out of a rock, and the body was laid on a stone slab. And then a gigantic round stone was rolled front of the entrance to prevent thieves and animals to enter into the tomb. And now back to the biblical account. Although there is 3 different renderings exist in the Gospel books of Jesus' burial, but let's have a look at John's. Why John's? Because John was actually the only disciple who was actually present at the crucifixion, because he was standing right in front of it with Jesus' mother Mary and also Mary Magdalene. And as we know from scripture, Jesus has appointed John to look after Jesus' mom, Mary, saying, "See your mother." And then he said to his mother, "See your son." So since John was an eyewitness to this all, in his account, if we examine it, let's have a look, let's have a read. John chapter 19 verses 38. "And after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him leave. He came therefore and took the body of Jesus. And there came also Nicodemus, which at first came to Jesus by night, and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pound weight, which is about 32 kilos or 70 pounds in today's measurements. Then took they the body of Jesus and wound it in linen cloths with the spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. So as we can see from scripture, contrary to this newspaper article when they were suggesting that they believed that Jesus' body was not washed during that time but quickly placed in a tomb, which means he was not cleaned of earthly materials before being wrapped. But now we can see that the biblical narrative actually confirms that Jesus' body has been cleaned according to Jewish custom. In fact, it was wrapped kind of like a mummy with the spices and with the herbs, and this was done very generously because, as you can see, it was 70 pounds or 32 kilograms in weight, was all this mixture of myrrh and aloes that Nicodemus has brought. So next, let's have a look at it, what the disciples actually found. John chapter 20 verses 4 to 8. So they ran both together, and the other disciple did outrun Peter. That the other disciple is talking about John, so he's talking about himself. And came first to the sepulchre. And he, stooping down and looking in, saw the linen cloth lying, yet went he not in. Then cometh Simon Peter following him, and went into the sepulchre, and seeth the linen clothes lie, plural, clothes lie, and the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. Then went in also the other disciple, which came first to the sepulchre, and he saw and believed. So as from the secular and historical account, and also from scripture, we can see that the sheet that was covering Jesus' face, it was a separate cloth. It wasn't a one piece. And that napkin was folded and put separately away from the rest of the bondages or burial cloths. And we can also see some of this description at the resurrection of Lazarus from John chapter 11, 43-44. That he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with the napkin. Jesus said unto them, loose him and let him go. So now we saw quite a few scriptures that confirming that Jesus was actually cleaned and prepared according to Jewish costume with spices and herbs. And this mixture was smeared between the layers of the burial shroud. So now if you're looking at the imprint of the shroud, the report, it didn't actually mention traces of myrrh and aloe. It mentions that these microscopic blood splatters contain evidence for organ failure, trauma, disease in the blood. Jesus was life and healing himself. They also find radiation, radioactivity, and oil, soil, and dust particles. Two different kinds of blood type, but the report doesn't mention a single thing about the mixture of the myrrh and aloe, which is quite significant, I would say. And if this cloth, according to the article, is the very shroud that was covering Jesus at the moment of his resurrection, explaining it with all this radioactivity and all these nuclear particles or whatnot, then we should also be finding with this mixture of aloe and myrrh. Not to mention that the face print, it should be on a different piece of cloth, on a napkin. I was also looking at the face of this figure, and I was surprised how calm and how together the whole face looked. Because then again, if you're taking the words of the biblical reference and the biblical narrative, it says that Jesus' face was marred more than any. Isaiah 52 verse 14 states, as many were astonished at thee, his visage was so marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So it says that his face and his countenance, his visage, was marred more than any man. The New Testament account says when he was taken into the soldiers' garrison, that before they forced the crown of thorns on his head and put the purple garment on him to mock him, all the soldiers of a cohort, which is 600 soldiers, every single one of them has took turns to punch and spit in Jesus' face. Now you can see what like a UFC fighter would look, or a professional boxer. Guys, imagine that Jesus' face was so swollen, battered and bruised that he was actually unrecognizable. He was marred more than any man. And although scripture says that none of his bones were broken, but there must have been an enormous amount of tissue damage from the flogging, which is basically ripped the skin and the muscles off of him. So it was actually a miracle that he has managed to carry the beam, the cross, or whatever you want to call it, to Calvary. If any of you have seen the film The Passion of the Christ, that's kind of a mild version what was the real truth. Because not only his skin and his muscles were just hanging down in ribbons, and his back was actually torn open from amounts of lashes that he received, but after all that he was punched in the face by soldiers, so you can imagine that his countenance, that his image was actually unrecognizable. He was marred more than any. Also, when I'm looking at the imprint of this person on the shroud, you notice that he had long hair, down the sides and in the back. But scripture actually tells us, the 1 Corinthians 11, 14, 15, which does not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him? But if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. So according to Jewish custom, a long hair was a shame for a man. So Jesus couldn't have had long hair because he was a law-abiding Jew at the time. So despite the traditional portrayal of Hollywood and medieval paintings and medieval stained glass works, Jesus did not have long hair. Definitely not long enough to pass his shoulders in the front and the back. Now what about the beard? On this imprint you can see the person has a nice full beard, full mustache and everything. What scripture tells us? Let's have a look. Isaiah chapter 50 verses 6 and 7. I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard. I did not hide my face from the shame and spitting. This is the messianic words that talks about Jesus. And you can see according to this verse that they actually tore out his beard. So there was no beard present on the face of Jesus, unlike this image on the shroud. But most importantly, the questions to ask is, for example, why would they keep this as a relic? Because this is inconsistent with biblical principles. Like if we, for example, taking the body of Moses, for example, we know from scripture that Satan himself and Michael the archangel had a barney about Jesus' body. Now, why would Satan want to use Moses' body? No doubt for reasons of worshipping, for adoration and such. So that's why it was one of the reasons God has himself buried Moses' body. So nobody would go and worship that place or worship the body or use it as a relic or use it as an object of worship of any kind. Because Jesus himself has explained that worship should not be at a place or to a thing, like neither at this mountain or nor at Jerusalem. So is no building, no mountain, and no relic should be worshipped, because the worshippers must worship with spirit and truth. So he wouldn't leave around a relic or an idol to worship, because the Bible actually teaches that God doesn't want us to make ourselves idols or images and bow down to them. But these are just my personal reflections and observations. If you choose to believe in this thing, you're more than welcome to. I'm not saying don't believe. You believe what you like. But when sensationalized things like this come out, we must remember, according to Jesus, that Satan himself will show signs and wonders. So it wouldn't be a massive feat for him to just superimpose Jesus' image on a piece of cloth or make an apparition of Mary in the sky. But Jesus says, do not believe, because many will say, look, he's here, look, he's there. But when he will actually returns, he says, every eye will see him. It's not going to be just for a selected few, but he said, as a lightning that fills the sky from east to the west, everyone will see him. But like I said, these are just my own personal opinions and my reaction to this. And I like to examine things by scripture, because that's the most reliable way for us to do it. And also not excluding secular, historical, archeological and cultural evidence. So in the light of all this and scripture, you make up your own mind. Hope you enjoyed this video. God bless you all, love you all, and we speak in the next one. Bye.